The helicopter hit the parking lot at 4:47 in the morning, rotor wash flattening every shrub within 50 feet, and three armed operators were through the emergency room doors before the duty nurse even registered what was happening. They moved past the attending physician without a glance, past the charge nurse, past the department head standing with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, the lead operator, chest armor, tactical radio, the kind of face that had stopped explaining itself years ago, walked the length of the trauma bay and stopped in front of the supply cart on the far wall, in front of the woman in the oversized blue scrubs holding a clipboard. He came to full attention, crisp, deliberate, the kind of salute that meant something. "Colonel Harlow, we need you back." Every person in that emergency room stopped breathing at the same moment. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit subscribe right now, because this channel is where the stories nobody tells out loud finally get told. Stories about the people everyone overlooks, the ones who turn out to be the most important people in the room. Hit the like button if this already has your attention, and drop a comment with your city and your country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's find out together. Now, let's go back to where this really started. 3 weeks before that helicopter touched down, nobody at Calloway Pines Medical Center knew a single true thing about the woman they called the Quiet One. Her name on the staff roster was Sarah Harlow. Her badge said Registered Nurse Level 2. Her assignment sheet read like a list of everything the hospital needed done and nobody wanted to do. Overnight inventory audits on C-Wing, isolation ward rotations, supply cart restocking that happened between 2 and 4 in the morning when the hallways went dim and the building settled into its nighttime version of itself. She showed up early every shift. She stayed past the end of every shift. She never complained about any of it. Not once. Not even on the nights when the complaint would have been completely fair. She was 38 years old and looked, depending on the day, somewhere between 31 and 45. The hard nights aged her. There were a lot of hard nights. She kept her dark hair pulled back tight enough that it should have given her a headache. Wore no jewelry, no personal items clipped to her badge lanyard except the badge itself. She ate alone in the break room during the window when the break room was empty. She spoke when spoken to, sometimes less than that. When she did talk, her voice came out lower than people expected, and she had a habit of watching a person's hands during conversation rather than their face, which some people found unsettling without being able to name the reason. The other nurses called her the ghost, but not in a way that meant anything kind. "She gives me the creeps," said Danny Foote, the day shift charge nurse, one Tuesday morning while pulling medications in the dispensing room. She was talking to Priya Solano, who worked the step-down unit and had twice attempted small talk with Sarah and gotten answers that were technically polite and completely unrevealing. Like she's always watching something that isn't there. "She's probably just shy," Priya said, without real conviction. "Shy people look nervous." "She doesn't look nervous. She looks like she's running calculations." Danny pulled her next medication and scanned the barcode. "I don't know, she's just strange." That was actually the most accurate observation anyone at Calloway Pines had produced about Sarah Harlow in 6 weeks of proximity to her, though Danny would have no way of understanding that for another 3 weeks. The nursing director at Calloway Pines was a woman named Renata Ogle. She had held the position for 11 years and had spent most of that time constructing a department that operated on clear hierarchy, defined roles, and a baseline understanding among staff that Renata's authority was not a thing to be tested. She was efficient and unsentimental about it and had never been particularly interested in being liked, which was a quality that served her well in certain aspects of administration and poorly in others. She had taken a dislike to Sarah Harlow within the first 2 weeks, and the dislike had calcified quickly into something that shaped decisions. It wasn't anything Sarah did wrong. It was something about what Sarah didn't do, which was react. Renata was accustomed to new staff members being visibly anxious around her, deferential in ways that confirmed where the authority sat. Sarah Harlow was correct in every professional respect, completed every task without a documentable error, and somehow managed to do all of it while conveying the impression that she was entirely unimpressed by the environment she was operating in. Not insubordinate, not even cold exactly, just settled. As if the performance noticed that other nurses dreaded and the scheduling power that Renata held over the department simply did not register as threats in whatever calculus Sarah was running. It irritated Renata in a way she couldn't name cleanly, so she named it something else. "She's not engaged," she told Dr. Marcus Webb, the chief of emergency medicine, at their weekly operations meeting. She completes her assignments, technically, but there's no initiative, no buy-in. I'm not sure she's the right fit for this department. Marcus Webb looked up from the agenda. He'd only noticed Sarah Harlow once directly, a moment 2 weeks prior when she'd quietly corrected a medication dilution calculation that a newer nurse was about to execute incorrectly. She'd leaned over without drama and said, "That concentration is off by a factor of 4, and stepped away before anyone could respond. He'd filed it away and hadn't returned to it. "She's been here 6 weeks, he said. "6 weeks is enough time to show me who someone is," Renata said, and moved on. After that meeting, Sarah's assignment shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would appear clearly punitive in any documentation, but shifted. She was pulled from the emergency intake rotation and moved to overnight supply auditing. She came off the cardiac monitoring schedule and went on to discharge paperwork processing. Each individual change had a stated staffing rationale. Taken together, the pattern meant something else. A deliberate narrowing of her access to anything clinical, a reduction of her function in the hospital to its most invisible and least skilled components. Sarah said nothing about any of it. She showed up for the overnight audits and completed them with the same precision she applied to everything else. She processed the discharge paperwork. She restocked the supply cart on C-Wing at 3 a.m. and signed off on the inventory sheets in her neat, economical handwriting and wheeled the cart back to the storage room. If she understood what was happening, and she understood exactly what was happening, nothing in her face or her body or her behavior acknowledged it. What she was doing, quietly and without anyone noticing, was learning the hospital the way she had learned other buildings in other circumstances. In 6 weeks, she had the layout of every floor memorized, including the utility corridors that didn't appear on the standard staff orientation maps. She knew the emergency override sequences for all medication dispensing units, the location of every crash cart and defibrillator, the fastest unobstructed route between any 2 points in the building, and the fastest route accounting for peak hour congestion. She knew the names of every physician who rotated through the ER and had formed working assessments of each one, who performed well under pressure and who degraded, who listened and who didn't, who had the clinical instincts to change course midstream and who would follow a wrong diagnosis over a cliff rather than admit uncertainty. She knew the ER ran dangerously understaffed on Tuesday nights. She knew the overnight charge nurse on C-Wing had a consistent habit of skipping the 2 a.m. vitals check on stable patients. She knew the trauma bay's secondary crash cart had a laryngoscope blade that was the wrong size for an adult and had been filed as maintenance requested for 3 weeks with no resolution. She knew all of this the way she had learned to know things for 12 years, which was systematically and quietly, and without anyone realizing it was happening. The thing that nobody at Calloway Pines understood about Sarah Harlow was that her stillness was not passivity. It was not resignation or disengagement or any of the other things that Renata Ogle's performance notice implied. It was discipline. The particular and specific discipline of someone who had learned to hold herself completely still in environments where movement had consequences, who had made herself calm not because nothing was wrong, but because calm was the tool she needed to get through what came next. She had practiced that stillness in conditions that made an understaffed county hospital feel like a quiet afternoon. She had taken the job at Calloway Pines 4 months after separating from a position that didn't have a civilian job title, in a context she wasn't able to describe to anyone. The cover identity was well constructed. Sarah Harlow had a complete nursing employment history, 2 verifiable references, and a personnel file at a regional hospital in another state that would hold up to any routine check. What the file couldn't carry was the actual weight of her experience. 12 years of applied medicine in conditions that no hospital rotation prepared anyone for, in places that appeared on no assignment orders that would ever be made public, doing work that accumulated in her hands and in her memory, and that she had chosen, carefully and deliberately, to stop using. She had wanted the smallness of a civilian life, the anonymity, the rest that came from being nobody who mattered. She just hadn't anticipated what it would cost to have everything she knew and be treated like someone who knew nothing. Most mornings she could hold that. Some mornings it pressed on something she didn't have a clean name for, sitting in the break room at 3 a.m. with her paper cup of terrible coffee, aware in her hands and her chest, and the back of her mind of the specific weight of being this capable and this deliberately diminished. She held it anyway. She had made her choice. What she hadn't been able to choose was what happened on a Thursday night in November, when the highway 17 miles west became a catastrophe in under 4 minutes. The pileup hit at 9:14 p.m., in the rain, on an overpass where a commercial truck shed a rear axle without warning. The debris field crossed 3 lanes before the nearest vehicles could register and react. The physics of it were not complicated and not survivable without luck, and luck was unevenly distributed that night. By the time the first paramedic unit radioed Calloway Pines, the inbound count was 22 confirmed casualties, with a projected secondary surge of 12 to 15 from subsequent collisions up the backup. The ER charge that night was Danny Okafor, who was one of the better charged nurses in the department, organized under pressure, communicative in the way that mattered during mass casualty events, not prone to freezing. He had the pre-arrival protocol running before the second radio call came in. Trauma bay activation, all available clinical staff, equipment checks and secondary bay prep. The floor shifted into the particular controlled urgency that mass casualty events generated. Not chaos exactly, but the sensation of multiple simultaneous systems all operating at their ceiling. Sarah was in the storage corridor finishing the C-Wing cart when the overhead alert sounded. She set down the inventory sheet. She was at the trauma bay entrance in 80 seconds. Renata Ogle arrived shortly after, having received the alert on her personal phone during what appeared, based on her expression, to be a dinner she hadn't wanted to leave. She scanned the bay, the organized preparation, the staff in position, the attending physicians claiming their stations, and then she saw Sarah standing at the bay entrance in her scrubs. "Supply staging," Renata said, moving past her. "Keep the secondary cart stocked. Don't step into clinical space." "Understood," Sarah said. The secondary cart position was against the east wall. It happened to give her a direct sightline to every active trauma bay in the room. The first ambulance wave arrived at 9:31. 3 units within 4 minutes, then 2 private vehicles, then another ambulance, and the noise level in the room climbed and the staff absorbed it and kept working. Danny Okafor was routing patients and calling priorities and managing the controlled disorder. The way he did it well, firm and clear, and moving without wasted motion. The trauma bays filled. The supply demands got faster, and Sarah kept the cart stocked and moved a gurney that was blocking a corridor without being asked, and repositioned the secondary crash cart 2 feet to clear a path, and she watched. The young man arrived on the second wave at 9:44. He came in on a gurney with a paramedic at each side, and Sarah clocked the problem before the gurney cleared the bay entrance. He was 23, maybe 24, unrestrained passenger, significant impact. The paramedic handoff was fast. Dropping blood pressure, brief loss of consciousness at the scene, complaining of chest pain now. Dr. Marcus Webb took him. He was the best attending on the floor that night, and he moved efficiently to the bedside, and his hands were already on the patient, and his eyes were moving across the clinical picture the way an experienced physician's eyes moved, fast and pattern matching, seeking the most probable explanation for what he was seeing. The most probable explanation for dropping BP after chest trauma was internal bleeding, abdominal injury. It fit the mechanism. It fit the vitals. Webb called for a fast ultrasound and ordered large-bore IV access and blood typing and cross-matching, and his voice was controlled and his movements were efficient, and he was treating the right patient and the wrong diagnosis. Sarah was 12 feet away. She was watching the young man's chest. The right side wasn't moving the way the left side was moving. The asymmetry was subtle enough to miss in a busy room with overlapping voices and equipment noise, and the cognitive load of 17 other patients demanding attention simultaneously. The difference in chest excursion between the two sides was maybe 30%, the kind of thing that registered in peripheral vision as just slightly wrong before the conscious mind caught up with it. She looked at the base of his neck. The veins there were elevated in a way that didn't fit hemorrhagic shock, which caused blood pressure to drop partly because blood volume was inadequate to fill the venous system properly. What she was looking at was venous distension, blood pressure dropping because something was compressing the heart and great vessels from outside, preventing them from filling. She knew exactly what she was looking at. She had seen it in conditions where there was no trauma bay, no crash cart, no team, just her and a patient and whatever she had in her hands. Tension pneumothorax. The right lung had collapsed. Air was accumulating in the chest cavity with nowhere to go. Every breath the young man took made it worse. The pressure was building against his heart, and the major vessels, and in somewhere between 4 and 8 minutes, the compression would be sufficient to stop him entirely, and there would be nothing Webb's hemorrhage protocol could do about it. She set the saline bag down. She crossed the 12 feet to the bay. "Doctor?" Her voice was flat and clear and precisely loud enough to cut through the ambient noise without creating alarm. "I need you to look at his chest wall." Webb had a hand on the patient's abdomen. He didn't look up immediately. "We've got it covered." "His right chest isn't moving with respiration," she said. "JVD is building at the base of the neck. If the trachea hasn't deviated yet, it's going to." The second-year resident on the far side of the gurney, a young woman named Kim Ferris, who had been reaching for the ultrasound probe, stopped moving. She looked at the patient's neck. Something shifted in her face. Webb looked up then. He looked at Sarah. Not at the patient, at Sarah. And there was an edge in it, the particular edge of an experienced physician who has been redirected by someone he has categorized as a supply nurse in the middle of a mass casualty event. "You're on supply staging," he said. "We need the space." "I know what I'm describing," Sarah said, and her voice didn't change at all. "If I'm wrong, you lose 30 seconds. If I'm right, you have about 5 minutes. She held his eyes. "Look at his neck." "Dr. Webb." Kim Ferris already had her stethoscope moving. "JVD is present and it's increasing. Breath sounds." She got the diaphragm to his chest. "Absent on the right." Webb looked at his resident for exactly 1 second. Then he had his own stethoscope out, and it was at the patient's chest, and his face changed. The focused efficiency shifted into something faster and sharper, the recalibration of a physician who has just caught the edge of a mistake before it became irreversible. "Needle decompression kit," he called, and his voice had changed frequencies. "Now." The kit was in his hands in seconds. He found the landmark, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and the needle went in, and the rush of air that followed it was audible even over the noise in the room. The oxygen saturation monitor, which had been alarming through the low 80s, began its climb. Slowly at first, then faster. Sarah had already stepped back to the supply cart. She handed a package of dressings to a trauma nurse without being asked. She restocked 2 saline bags. She watched the young man's chest rise evenly for the first time since the gurney had come through the door, and she felt the specific quiet that came from a problem solved correctly, and she turned back to the cart. Webb looked across the bay at her when the immediate crisis had passed. His expression was not simple. She could read the layers of it, the acknowledgement that she had been right, the discomfort of what that meant, the unresolved question of who she actually was and where that clinical read had come from. And she gave him nothing to answer with because she was already looking at the inventory sheet and not at him. By 2 a.m., the trauma bay had processed 33 patients. One of them didn't make it, which was a number that should have been higher given the mechanism and the volume, and the staff carried that fact without discussing it, the way ER staff carried those facts. The energy in the room at 2 a.m. was the specific, exhausted flatness of people who had done something real and were too tired to feel anything about it yet. Sarah was heading for the exit when Renata Ogle appeared beside her. "My office," Renata said. "Now." The office was off the supply corridor, and it was small, and the fluorescent tube in it buzzed slightly, which Sarah noticed the way she noticed most physical details in enclosed spaces. Renata closed the door. "You left your assigned station twice tonight and inserted yourself into an active clinical bay," Renata said. "That's a direct violation of your role boundaries. The patient is alive because Dr. Webb made the correct diagnosis." Renata's voice was flat and administrative and entirely certain of itself. "I don't need your version of events. What I need is for you to understand that this cannot happen again." She opened the desk drawer and produced a printed form. "This is a formal performance notice. Repeated boundary violations will result in termination." Sarah looked at the form. She looked at Renata. She held the silence for 3 seconds, which was long enough that Renata shifted almost imperceptibly. "Understood," Sarah said. She took her copy of the form. She left the office. She went to the break room and poured 3 ounces of coffee into a paper cup and sat at the far table and spent 11 minutes looking at the wall in the particular way of someone who is not spacing out but is doing something with their internal architecture that doesn't have a visible external component. She filed it. Renata Ogle's face, the form, the shape of the evening, all of it. into the place where she kept things that were real but not yet actionable. She sealed it with the same deliberate precision she applied to everything else. Then she washed the cup and went back to the floor. Kim Ferris caught up with her in the parking lot at 3:50 a.m. The resident was still in her scrubs, jacket thrown over them, holding a coffee cup that was probably more for warmth than for caffeine at this point. She looked young and exhausted and slightly uncertain about the conversation she was initiating. "I just wanted to—" She stopped, started over. "What you called in there? The tension pneumo. I've seen attendings miss that." Sarah kept walking toward her car. Dr. Webb caught it. "After you said something." Kim fell into step beside her. She had the cadence of someone who had been rehearsing this. "Where did you train? I don't mean nursing school. I mean, where did you actually learn to read a chest like that from across a room, in that much noise, in that situation?" "A long time ago," Sarah said. "That's not a real answer." Sarah reached her car, a 4-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked passenger mirror she kept meaning to have fixed, and unlocked it. She stood with her hand on the door for a moment. "I was a medic," she said. "Before nursing." "What kind of medic?" She looked at Kim over the roof of the car. The resident was watching her with the focused attention of someone who understood that the answer she got right now might be the only honest one she ever got. Sarah held that for a moment. "The kind where the patients don't usually come in by ambulance," she said. She got in the car. She started the engine. Kim Ferris stood in the parking lot and watched the taillights move toward the exit, and she stood there for a long moment after they disappeared before she turned and went back inside. The performance notice went into Sarah's file the next morning. By noon, it had been read by 3 people in Renata Ogle's network, which meant that by the time Sarah arrived for her evening shift, the story had been translated through 3 iterations into something that bore almost no relationship to what had actually occurred, into a version where the supply nurse had recklessly interfered with an attending physician during a mass casualty event and had to be corrected for the safety of the patients. Sarah heard fragments of it in the medication corridor, a version in the elevator. She heard Danny Foote tell a travel nurse that the woman simply didn't understand her role and that the hospital was lucky nothing had gone wrong. She heard all of it and kept moving. What happened over the following 2 weeks was incremental and methodical. Her schedule shifted further toward the work nobody wanted and away from anything clinical. Her access to the trauma bay was informally but clearly revoked. Whenever she was present during a case, someone found a reason to redirect her. 2 of her request shifts were denied without explanation. The environment didn't become openly hostile. It became something quieter and more sustained. The specific pressure of an institution deciding that you didn't belong, applied consistently and with administrative cover. Most people would have left. Sarah had been in environments that made this one feel like a minor inconvenience. She kept showing up. She kept doing the work she was assigned. She restocked the carts and processed the paperwork and completed the inventory sheets and filed every evening's indignities in the compartment where they would sit until something changed or nothing did. What changed was the text message. She was finishing the C-Wing overnight audit at 4:15 a.m. on the 14th day after the performance notice. The corridor was dim and quiet, and she was working through the final section of the checklist when her phone buzzed. Not the work phone. The other one. The one with a contact list containing exactly 4 names, none of which appeared in any public directory, the one whose number she had given to no one at Calloway Pines, and no one in this city. The text was from a blocked number. It was 6 characters. She recognized the code immediately. She had not seen or heard it in 3 years and 4 months, and she had spent most of that time believing she would not see it again. She stood in the dim corridor for a long moment with the phone in her hand. The fluorescent tube above her buzzed slightly. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor alarmed briefly and then settled. She was aware of her own breathing in the way she became aware of it in certain kinds of situations. Not faster, not changed, just present in her attention. She deleted the message. She put the phone in her pocket. She completed the audit. She initialed the final checklist items in her neat handwriting and dated the sheet and left it in the appropriate tray and wheeled the cart back to the storage room and signed off on the log. But something had shifted inside the stillness, and anyone who knew what to look for, and almost no one in this building came close to knowing, would have been able to see it. A quality of attention that had been dormant was now oriented. The waiting that had no direction had found one. By the time she changed out of her scrubs and walked to her car in the pale early dark of a November morning, Sarah Harlow was not quite the same version of herself that had clocked in 8 hours earlier. She was still quiet, still controlled, still entirely unremarkable to anyone who passed her in the parking lot. But something that had been resting had opened its eyes. And whatever was coming, it was coming fast. But something that had been resting had opened its eyes, and whatever was coming, it was coming fast. She drove home through streets that were empty at that hour, except for delivery trucks and one taxi idling outside a closed diner. The apartment she rented was on the third floor of a building that had nothing wrong with it and nothing memorable about it either, which was exactly why she'd chosen it. She parked in the lot, took the stairs, unlocked the door, and stood in the small kitchen for a moment without turning on the overhead light. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street below. She stood in the dark and ran the 6-character code through her memory one more time, unpacking what it meant in the system she'd used for the years she didn't talk about. It meant activate. It meant something has moved. It meant be ready without being obvious about it. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands around the cup, and she thought carefully about the 4 names in that phone's contact list, and which of them would have sent this particular code and why now, after 3 years and 4 months of silence. She didn't arrive at a clean answer, which didn't surprise her. Clean answers were for situations where you had full information, and she had 6 characters and a blocked number and whatever she could infer from that, which was enough to know the shape of something without knowing the details. The details would come. They always came. She slept for 4 hours. She ate. She went back to Calloway Pines for her evening shift, and she was exactly as invisible as she had been the day before and the week before and every week before that, and nothing in her face suggested that anything had changed. The next 4 days were ordinary in every visible respect. Supply audits, paperwork processing, the Sea-Wing cart at 3 a.m. Renata Ogle passed her in the corridor twice and didn't speak to her, which was its own form of communication. Kim Ferris caught her eye once in the medication room and gave her a small nod that was more than a greeting and less than a conversation, and Sarah returned it and kept moving. On the 5th day, 2 things happened. The first was that Renata called her into the office at the start of her shift and informed her, in the flat administrative tone she used for these conversations, that Sarah's hours were being reduced to 3 shifts per week, effective immediately due to a departmental budget adjustment. The phrasing was careful and deniable. Sarah had worked full-time since her hiring date, and the budget had not been the reason for the reduction, but the budget was the reason that would appear in any documentation. Renata set the revised schedule on the desk between them and folded her hands and waited. Sarah looked at the schedule. She looked at Renata. She picked up the schedule. "Understood," she said. "Any questions?" Renata asked, in a tone that didn't actually want any. "No," Sarah said. She left the office and stood in the hallway for a moment, holding the revised schedule, and she acknowledged to herself privately that this was the next step in a process that had a known endpoint, that Renata Ogle had decided to remove her and was doing it carefully enough to be bulletproof about it, and that within a month, probably less, there would be another conversation and a different piece of paper, and Sarah would no longer work here. She folded the schedule and put it in her pocket. She had 45 minutes before her shift started. She used them to complete a full walk of the hospital's east wing that she hadn't done in 2 weeks, updating her internal map, noting a new equipment storage arrangement in the secondary supply room, clocking the schedule of the environmental services staff who worked that corridor. She did it efficiently and without appearing to do it deliberately, the way she did most things. The second thing that happened was that Marcus Webb found her at the supply cart at 7 p.m. He came without preamble, which she'd noticed was his general approach. He didn't build up to things. "You have a minute," he said, and it wasn't entirely a question. "Yes," she said. He stood beside the cart rather than across from her, which she noted. Not a confrontation position, something else. "I've been thinking about the other night," he said. "The Whitmore kid." She didn't know that was the young man's name, but she filed it. He went home this morning, talked to his mother in the hallway. She wanted to know who'd caught it. He stopped. Sarah kept her hands on the cart inventory. "Dr. Webb caught it." "You know what I mean." She looked at him then. I was in his early 50s, solid, the kind of physician who had probably been excellent for so long he'd stopped noticing it, and he was looking at her with an expression that was part professional assessment and part something she didn't have a category for from him yet. "I've seen medics who did multiple combat tours who couldn't read a chest like that in those conditions," he said. "What's your actual background?" "My file is on record with HR," she said. "I read your file." He said it simply, without accusation. "Your file is fine. Your file doesn't explain what I watched you do." The corridor was quiet around them. A nursing assistant pushed a linen cart past the far end without looking their way. Sarah held the silence for a moment, running the calculation. What to give him, what it cost, what it bought. "I worked trauma medicine in austere environments for about 12 years, she said, "before I came here." "What kind of austere environments?" "The kind that don't generate records that show up in civilian HR databases," she said. "I'm not being evasive. That's a factual description of the documentation situation." Webb looked at her for a long moment. She could see him recategorizing her in real time, updating something that had been filed incorrectly when she arrived and had been generating friction ever since. "Renata cut your hours," he said. "Budget adjustment," Sarah said. "Right." The word carried a weight that the explanation didn't deserve. He looked at the cart, then back at her. "I'm going to be honest with you. I don't have leverage over staffing decisions. That's her department. I know that. But I wanted you to know that I'm—" He stopped, started again. "I'm paying attention, that's all." He left. Sarah watched him go and felt something she didn't entirely have a name for. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated. The specific sensation of being seen by someone competent who had the honesty to admit the limits of what they could do about it. She turned back to the inventory sheet. She didn't let herself build anything on it. The reduced schedule put her on Tuesday and Thursday nights, and one Saturday rotation, which meant she was in the building for the second Tuesday night understaffing pattern she'd identified in her first month, but now without the buffer of additional staff that a full weekly rotation provided. She noticed this and filed it and showed up on Tuesday at 5 p.m. with the same expression she showed up with every other day. What happened at 8:40 p.m. on that Tuesday was not something anyone had scheduled. The call came into the ER before the patient arrived, which gave them 4 minutes of warning and not much else. 41-year-old male, found unresponsive in his vehicle in a parking structure downtown, history unknown, responding minimally to stimuli, vitals unstable. The paramedic on the radio sounded controlled but terse, which was the vocal register that meant something was wrong in a way that hadn't been fully classified yet. Danny Okafor wasn't on that night. The charge was a woman named Bev Strand, who was experienced and capable, and who was also managing 2 active chest pain workups and a pediatric fever case that was running toward a spinal tap, which meant her attention was divided in ways that were entirely legitimate and still left gaps. The attending who took the unresponsive male was Dr. Philip Gartner, who was covering a shift he'd picked up to fill a gap left by a colleague's sick day. Gartner was competent. He was also 63 years old and 4 years past what had probably been his peak clinical performance, and he was tired in the specific accumulated way of a physician who had been covering extra shifts for a department that was chronically understaffed. He didn't make errors the way young physicians made errors, from lack of knowledge. He mud the errors of exhaustion and pattern matching and a certain long-practiced confidence in his own initial read that had stopped being fully calibrated to the situation in front of him. Sarah was at the supply cart position against the east wall, where she'd been placed because it was the position she'd been placed in every shift since the mass casualty night, and she watched the patient come through the doors. He was a big man, heavy-set, his skin an ashen gray that wasn't the gray of normal pallor. The paramedics had him on oxygen and one IV was running. His respiratory rate was wrong, too slow, too shallow, with a pattern that didn't fit simple unconsciousness. Sarah watched his face and his chest, and she watched the way his jaw was positioned, and she thought, he's not just unconscious, he's going to stop breathing. Gartner did his assessment. He called for glucose because hypoglycemia could cause unresponsiveness, which was correct differential thinking. He ordered a 12 lead because cardiac events presented like this, which was also correct. He was building his workup systematically, and the system was fine, and the patient's airway was going to close in the next 7 to 10 minutes if nobody interrupted the system. Sarah crossed the floor. She didn't go to Gartner. She went to Bev Strand, who was passing through the bay on her way to the pediatric case. His respiratory drive is depressing, Sarah said quietly. He needs airway management now, not after the workup. Bev stopped. She looked at Sarah with the expression of a charge nurse, who recognized the supply nurse who had already been in trouble once, and who was also, in the same instant, registering the clinical concern as something worth examining. "Gartner's on it," she said, but she was already looking at the patient. "His rate is 9 and dropping," Sarah said. "Look at the jaw positioning." Bev looked. She stood still for 2 seconds, which was 2 seconds of a charge nurse running a calculation that Sarah had already run. Then Bev was moving toward the bay, not rushing in a way that would create alarm, but moving with the particular purposeful speed of someone who has decided to verify something immediately. "Philip," Bev said, reaching Gartner's side. "What's his respiratory rate?" Gartner checked the monitor. His expression shifted slightly. 8, he said, and the number was lower than he'd been assuming, lower than it had been when the patient arrived, and he stood for 1 second with that information before he called for the airway cart. Sarah was back at the supply cart by the time the call went out. The intubation happened fast and correctly, and the patient's oxygen saturation stabilized, and in the controlled activity that followed, nobody said out loud that the call had come from the supply staging nurse because nobody had seen it clearly enough to say so with certainty. Bev Strand knew. Bev stood at the supply cart 20 minutes later and looked at Sarah with an expression that was layered with things she hadn't decided how to organize yet. "That's twice," Bev said. "The airway presentation was clear," Sarah said. "That's not what I—" Bev stopped, lowered her voice. "Who are you?" "Sarah Harlow," Sarah said. "RN level 2, currently on supply staging." Bev looked at her for a long moment with the specific expression of a very experienced nurse who understands that she's been given a technically accurate answer that isn't an answer at all. "You can't keep doing this," she said. "Renata will—" "I know," Sarah said. "Then why—" "Because otherwise he stops breathing," Sarah said. "That's the whole reason." Bev Strand stood there for a moment. Then she picked up a supply requisition from the cart and signed it and left without saying anything else, and Sarah understood that as its own kind of answer. The incident with the unresponsive male did not result in another formal notice, because Bev Strand wrote the intake note in a way that was accurate without being specific about the chain of events, and because Gartner hadn't fully registered where the initial flag had originated, and because the patient had stabilized and the outcome was good, and nobody wanted to spend administrative energy on a good outcome. Sarah knew she had been given a narrow pass, and she did not mistake it for anything more than that. What she did not know, and would not have expected, was that Kim Ferris had been in the bay for the last 6 minutes of the intubation procedure and had seen Bev Strand's conversation with Sarah from across the room, and had spent the next 3 days thinking about what she'd observed and what it meant, and what, if anything, she should do about it. Kim Ferris had grown up in a family where the women fixed things quietly, without waiting for permission or recognition, and then watched those same women get passed over and diminished, and pushed to the side by institutions that benefited from their competence, while refusing to acknowledge it. She'd gone into medicine partly because she thought medicine would be different, and had spent 2 years of residency recalibrating that expectation into something more accurate and more useful. She had a resident's limited institutional power and a considerable amount of the kind of intelligence that recognized a situation clearly and decided what to do about it. On the 4th day after the intubation incident, she did something that was not dramatic but was not nothing. She went to Marcus Webb's office during a gap in her afternoon schedule, and she sat down and she told him what she had observed over the past several weeks, specifically and without editorializing. She told him about the tension pneumothorax call. She told him about the unresponsive male. She told him what Bev Strand had said to her in the hallway afterward, which was that the supply nurse had flagged both situations before any clinical staff had arrived at the same conclusion. She told him what Sarah had said to her in the parking lot about austere environments and documentation that didn't appear in civilian HR databases. Webb listened without interrupting. He was good at listening without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. When Kim finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She's being pushed out," he said. "Yes," Kim said. "And you're telling me this because I've watched 2 patients survive in the last 3 weeks because of a woman who's been assigned to restock saline bags," Kim said. "And I don't know what to do with that, but I thought you should know about it." Webb looked at his desk. He looked at the schedule on the wall. He looked at Kim with the expression of a man who understood the limits of his authority and the weight of the situation with equal clarity. "I appreciate you coming to me," he said. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I'm going to think carefully, he said. That's honest. It wasn't the answer Kim had been hoping for, but it was an honest one, and she recognized the difference. She thanked him and left, and Webb sat in his office for a while after she'd gone, and Sarah Harlow was in the supply corridor replacing expired IV tubing, and none of them knew that the thing coming toward all of them was already in motion 3 states away. Sarah's second Thursday shift that week ran from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. It was the quieter kind of Thursday. 2 chest pains, 1 laceration repair, a handful of upper respiratory complaints, the ordinary work of a mid-volume ER on a cold November night. She moved through her assigned tasks with the efficiency that was simply her baseline, and at 10:30 p.m. she was in the storage corridor pulling a replacement defibrillator pad kit when her phone buzzed. The other phone. Not a text this time, a call from the same blocked number. She looked at the screen for 1 ring. Then she went 6 steps further into the corridor, to the junction where the utility hallway intersected and the ambient sound from the floor dropped, and she answered it. Harlow. Her own voice was flat. Not cautious. Flat. The voice of someone who had answered calls like this before and knew what register they required. The voice on the other end was one she recognized immediately, though she hadn't heard it in 3 years. It belonged to a man named Lev Draper, which was not the name he'd been born with, but was the name she'd known him by through 2 deployments and 1 operation that had no official designation. He was not a man who used extra words. We have a situation, he said. I gathered, she said. 6 characters was enough. It's Harwick, he said. The name landed in her chest with a specific weight. She stood in the utility corridor and let it land and didn't say anything for 3 seconds, which was the amount of time it took to absorb the information and then set aside the personal component of absorbing it and arrive at the operational side. I thought Harwick was contained, she said. He was. He's not anymore. He walked out of a federal medical holding facility 11 days ago. We're still reconstructing how. A pause. He left a message, addressed to you by name. Your real name. What did it say? It said he'd been thinking about unfinished business, and that he had a project he wanted to complete. Another pause. There's more. He's been in contact with 2 of his former research associates who were never charged. We think they've been working. We think they've been working for a while. Sarah's hand was very still on the phone. Working on what? That's what we don't know yet. That's part of why I'm calling. Outside the utility corridor, somewhere on the floor, a monitor alarmed briefly. The building continued its ordinary nighttime functions around her, entirely indifferent to the conversation happening in its infrastructure. What do you need from me? She asked. Not yet, Draper said. Right now I need you to know he's out. I need you to be careful, and I need you to be reachable. I've been reachable, she said. I know. Something in his voice shifted. Not quite apology, not quite acknowledgement. Something in between. How are you doing? Out there in the civilian? I'm fine, she said. The words were automatic and also completely true, in the way that a very narrow definition of fine could be true. Don't worry about me. Worry about where Harwick is. I'm worrying about both, Draper said. Call me if anything feels wrong. Anything at all. He knows where you are, Sarah. The line went dead. She stood in the corridor for 11 seconds. She counted them without meaning to, an old habit from environments where counting seconds was a form of control when other forms weren't available. Then she put the phone in her pocket and picked up the defibrillator pad kit and walked back to the supply cart and continued her shift. She did not tell anyone what she'd heard. She did not alter anything visible about her behavior, her expression, or her patterns of movement through the building. But something had changed in the hierarchy of what she was paying attention to, and anyone trained to see it would have noticed the slight expansion of her perimeter awareness, the way her eyes moved through doorways a half second before the rest of her did, the way she positioned herself differently at the supply cart, with the wall closer to her back. Small adjustments, the kind that didn't register as behavior to anyone who didn't know what to look for. She knew what Harwick was. She knew what he was capable of. And she knew that the message he'd left, the one addressed to her real name, the name that wasn't on her badge, the name that wasn't in the Calloway Pines HR system, meant that whatever separation she'd constructed between her previous life and her current one had just been rendered meaningless. She finished her shift at 1:07 a.m. She walked to her car with her keys already in her hand, not because she was afraid. Fear wasn't quite the right word for what she was running, but because she was operational in a way she hadn't been in 3 years. And operational meant not making avoidable mistakes. She drove home the long way. She took 3 right turns in sequence 4 blocks from her apartment building, which was an old counter-surveillance technique that felt slightly absurd in a residential neighborhood at 1 a.m., and which she did anyway, because Draper had said Harwick knew where she was, and she had learned a long time ago not to let absurdity talk her out of basics. The apartment was as she'd left it. She checked it the way she'd checked rooms before, quickly, methodically, not theatrically. Then she sat at the kitchen table with her work phone on one side and the other phone on the other side, and she opened her laptop, and she began to search for what she could find in open sources about a federal medical holding facility having a security breach 11 days ago. She found nothing, which was itself information, the kind of information that confirmed the breach had been managed quietly, which confirmed it was serious enough to require managing quietly, which meant Draper had not been overstating the situation. She closed the laptop at 3 a.m. She set an alarm for 7. She lay on the bed without undressing and looked at the ceiling and thought about Harwick, about the specific and particular way his mind worked, about what unfinished business meant to a man with his background and his methodology, about what a project looked like when it came from him. She thought about the research associates who'd never been charged. She thought about what they might have been working on, and for how long, and in what kind of facility. She didn't sleep. At 6:47 a.m., her other phone rang again. She had it to her ear before the second ring. Harlow. Draper's voice was different, tighter. Something had happened in the hours since his last call. "We have a location," he said, "and we have a problem. He's not just building something, he's moving something. We think it's already at a secondary site, and we think the secondary site is operational." She sat up. "Where?" "We're narrowing it, Sarah." A pause. In 3 years and 2 deployments, she had heard Lev Draper pause like that exactly once before, and it had preceded information that changed the shape of a situation fundamentally. The secondary site, based on what we're seeing in the movement patterns, the supply chain, the timing. He stopped. "Tell me," she said. "It's close to you," he said. "It's very close to where you are." The ceiling of her apartment was ordinary and white and completely still above her, and Sarah Harlow lay on her bed with the phone at her ear and felt the specific sensation of a world that had contracted to a single point of convergence and understood that the 3 years of rest were over. "How close?" she said. "Within 40 miles of your current position, possibly less." Draper's voice had the quality it got when he was reading from something while talking. The slight compression of attention split 2 ways. "We picked up a supply chain trace 2 hours ago. Medical-grade refrigeration units, specific culture medium components, and a pressurized delivery system that matches Harwick's prior methodology. All moving through a distribution network he used before, slightly modified. Whoever helped him set this up has been careful, but not careful enough." Sarah was already sitting up, already running through the geography in her head. The industrial corridors east of the city, the decommissioned research parks along the river, the converted warehouse districts that had been partially redeveloped and partially left to become the kind of spaces where you could move equipment without generating interest. "What's the agent?" she asked. A pause. "We're not confirmed." "Best assessment." "Respiratory delivery. Aerosolized. Based on the refrigeration specs and the culture medium, probably bacterial, not viral. Harwick's background is gram-negative pathogen modification. He's done it before." Another pause, this one heavier. "Sarah, if he's had 3 years to work on this with people who weren't charged, and who therefore had access to legitimate research infrastructure, it could be significantly worse than what he had before," she said. "Yes." She stood up. She was already calculating what she needed, what she didn't have, what the timeline looked like. "You said you're narrowing the location. How long until you have it?" "Hours, maybe less. We have a team assembling, but they're coming from 3 different staging points. Earliest boots on ground, realistically, is 6 to 8 hours from now. That's not fast enough if he's already at a secondary site and operational." "I know that." "Lev." She used his name, which she almost never did. "What do you actually need from me?" The silence on the line was 3 seconds long, which was Draper deciding something. "We need the location confirmed before we move. We have 2 possible sites. One is a former pharmaceutical cold storage facility off Route 9 east of Mercer County. The other is a converted research annex attached to an abandoned agricultural processing plant near Tolliver Creek. We need eyes on both before the team arrives, and we need to know which one is active. You need a scout, she said. I need someone who knows what Harwick's operational signature looks like from the outside. Ventilation patterns, power draw indicators, the specific way he sets up a perimeter. He paused. You've been inside 2 of his facilities. You know what you're looking at. She stood in the middle of her apartment in her clothes from the night before, the morning light coming in gray and flat through the window, and she made the calculation she'd been making since the first text message arrived, the one she'd been pretending she wasn't making. Send me the coordinates for both sites, she said. I'll call you when I have something. Sarah, don't, she said. Just send them. The coordinates arrived 2 minutes later. She changed her clothes, drank half a cup of cold coffee from the pot she'd made at 3 a.m., and left the apartment. Ciao. She took the highway east and then the county road south, and the landscape changed from the mid-density residential grid of the city's edge to the flatter, more dispersed territory of light industrial and agricultural land that sat in the gap between Calloway County and the next jurisdiction over. It was the kind of geography that existed in most mid-sized American regions. Not rural enough to be isolated, not urban enough to generate sustained attention. The places where things could happen in plain sight because the infrastructure around them was ordinary enough to absorb them without comment. The first site, the pharmaceutical cold storage facility off Route 9, she dismissed in 11 minutes. The building was locked correctly, which was wrong. Harwick's facilities always had a reason for someone to be present, a visible operational justification, because pure abandonment generated more questions than activity. The power meter on the exterior showed baseline draw consistent with minimal security lighting and nothing else. The ventilation stack on the roof was cold, no thermal differential, which meant no biological culture processes running at scale. She photographed what she needed and left without stopping. The drive to the second site took 23 minutes. She smelled it before she saw it. Not the agent. Nothing olfactory about a properly contained biological process would be detectable at this distance. What she smelled was the specific combination of diesel generator exhaust and the chemical signature of industrial HVAC systems running at higher than ambient temperature, which meant sustained heat generation inside a building that should, by its exterior appearance, be inactive. It was faint enough that you'd have to know what you were looking for, and she knew exactly what she was looking for. The converted research annex sat behind a tree line off a service road that connected 2 larger roads without being a route anyone would take unless they had a reason. The building was a 2-story concrete structure with the rectangular bluntness of 1970s functional architecture attached to a larger agricultural processing shell that had been mostly stripped. The perimeter had been maintained, no overgrowth on the access paths, no debris accumulation at the entry points. Small things that told you someone had been managing the site consistently. There were 2 vehicles in the lot behind the tree line, visible only from the service road's curve, parked in the shadow of the building's east wall. She pulled over on the service road, killed the engine, and sat. She called Draper. Site 2, she said. Tolliver Creek Annex, active. You're sure? Generator running. HVAC thermal differential visible on the south wall. 2 vehicles, partial concealment, east lot. Access paths maintained. She paused. There's also a ventilation modification on the north face of the building. Someone added an auxiliary exhaust stack that wasn't on the original structure. Harwick does that for positive pressure containment when he's working with aerosolized agents. Keeps the interior at slightly higher pressure than ambient, so nothing migrates inward through gaps. The silence on Draper's end was the silence of information being absorbed and acted on simultaneously. Okay, he said. Okay. I'm moving the team. 6 hours. That's still not fast enough, she said. It's what we have. How many people does he have in there? Best estimate, 2 to 4. His former associates, possibly 1 or 2 additional hired personnel. A pause. Sarah, do not go in. I need to be direct with you about that. Reconnaissance only. If he's at the operational stage, I'm not going in, she said. She wasn't lying exactly. She genuinely did not intend to go in at that moment. What she intended was to maintain observation, establish a better perimeter read, and wait for the team. That was the correct tactical decision given what she knew. She had made correct tactical decisions in worse situations with less information. What changed the calculus was the van. It arrived on the service road from the opposite direction at 8:47 a.m., moving faster than the road warranted, and it turned into the annex lot without slowing at the entry point. The side panels were white with a commercial logo for a medical equipment company that she was almost certain didn't exist, which was standard cover for logistics runs to facilities that didn't want to explain their supply chains. She watched two people get out of the van. One went to the building entrance. One opened the van's rear doors and began moving equipment on a hand truck. The equipment was in sealed containers she recognized, not because she'd seen this brand or this model. Because she had seen what those containers were designed to carry, had seen the specific dimensions and the bio-seal closures and the color-coded pressure indicators, and she understood with a cold clarity what it meant that they were being moved now, this morning, with urgency. He was staging for delivery, not in 6 hours. Now. She called Draper back. He answered in one ring. "He's moving product," she said. "Van just arrived. They're loading sealed biocontainment transport units." "Lev, he's not in a prep phase. He's in a delivery phase. He has something ready, and he's moving it." The sound on Draper's end shifted, background noise changing, voices. "How many units?" "I can see 4 from my position. There may be more inside." "What's the target?" His voice had gone to the frequency it went to when he was past analysis and into response mode. "Did you get anything on a target?" "No. But if he's using aerosolized delivery and he has 4 more units ready, you're looking at a space with significant air volume. An enclosed public space. Transit hub? Venue? Medical facility?" She stopped. The word hung in her own mind with a weight that was disproportionate to its syllables. Medical facility. She thought about what Harwick had said in the message addressed to her real name. Unfinished business. A project he wanted to complete. She thought about what she had done to him. What her testimony, her documentation, her refusal to stay quiet had done to his career and his freedom and his standing among the people who had funded his work. She thought about what a man with his specific psychology would select as a target if he wanted to cause maximum damage and maximum symbolic resonance simultaneously. She thought about Calloway Pines Medical Center. The thought arrived not as panic, but as a logical conclusion, cold and complete, and she sat with it for exactly 4 seconds before she called Draper back. "I think the target is the hospital," she said. "Calloway Pines. It's the closest major medical facility to this location, and it fits the symbolic profile. He blamed the medical establishment as much as he blamed me, and I've been working there for 4 months." Draper was quiet for 2 seconds. "That's not confirmed." "No," she said. "But if I'm right and we wait 6 hours, I know." His voice was compressed. "I'm calling Federal Emergency Response right now, but Sarah, I need you to—" He stopped. She could hear him making the same calculation she was making, weighing the same variables. "I need you to think carefully about what you do next." "I am thinking carefully," she said. "I've been thinking carefully for 6 hours." She hung up. She sat on the service road in her car for 45 seconds, which was enough time to build the operational picture with what she had, and to identify the gap between what the situation required and what the official response timeline could deliver, and to make the decision that she had been, on some level, building towards since the first text message. Then she started the car and drove back toward Calloway Pines. She called the hospital's main line from the road and asked for the nursing supervisor on duty and got Bev Strand, which was either convenient or something else, and she didn't stop to classify it. "It's Sarah Harlow," she said. A pause. "You're not on today," Bev said. "I know. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to not ask me how I know what I'm about to tell you." She was doing 73 on the county road with both hands on the wheel. "There may be a threat to the hospital, a serious one. I need you to quietly, without creating a public alarm, identify your ventilation system control points and be ready to initiate emergency air handling shutdown on my call." The silence on Bev's end was the silence of a very experienced nurse deciding in real time whether the person she was talking to was credible or in crisis. Sarah understood the calculation and let her run it. "Sarah," Bev said carefully, "what kind of threat?" "The kind that comes through the air handling system," Sarah said. "I can't give you more than that right now. I need to know if you can do what I'm asking. Another pause, shorter this time. The HVAC emergency shutoff. Shutoff is in the plant operations room in the basement. I have access. Good. Don't do anything yet. Don't tell anyone yet except Webb. If you can reach him quietly, I'll call you in. She calculated the drive time, 18 minutes. Sarah. Bev's voice had dropped lower, the tone of someone who had decided to believe something and was now being careful about it. Are you safe? Yes, Sarah said. Focus on the HVAC panel. She disconnected and pressed the accelerator. She arrived at Calloway Pines at 9:31 a.m. and went through the employee entrance rather than the main entrance, which was a decision based on the specific way she wanted to move through the building in the next few minutes. The badge still worked. Her employment hadn't been formally terminated, only reduced, and she went through the door and down the service corridor and took the stairs to the second floor and was at the door of Marcus Webb's office in 4 minutes. She knocked once and opened the door. Webb was at his desk with a coffee cup and a tablet and the expression of a man who had not expected his morning to go this direction. He looked at her, at the clothes that weren't scrubs, at whatever was in her face, and put the tablet down. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. She stood in front of his desk and she told him what she knew, quickly and without unnecessary framing. The facility, the biocontainment transport units, the timeline, her assessment of the target. She told him what she needed from him, which was controlled, non-alarming evacuation preparation for the East Wing ventilation zones, and direct contact with the hospital's safety officer to have the emergency HVAC protocols accessible on short notice. She told him in 90 seconds. Then she stopped and let him process it. He was quiet for a moment. His face ran through several things in sequence: skepticism, assessment, recognition of something, and then the specific look of a person who has encountered a situation that is outside their framework and has decided to trust the person in front of them rather than spend time they don't have reevaluating their priors. "How do you know all of this?" he said. "I can't answer that fully right now," she said. "What I can tell you is that I've spent 12 years working in contexts where this kind of threat was part of what I was trained for, and what I'm describing is not a guess. Federal response is inbound. It will not arrive fast enough if the timeline I'm projecting is correct." He looked at her for 3 seconds. 3 full seconds, which felt different from the way 3 seconds usually felt. "What do you need from me?" he said. Something in her chest released a tension she hadn't consciously been holding. "I need you to trust me for the next 2 hours," she said, "and I need you to call your safety officer right now." He was already reaching for his phone. Well, the next 40 minutes were the most controlled chaos Sarah had managed in 3 years, and controlled was a relative term. She coordinated the building's emergency ventilation team through Webb, who had the authority she currently didn't and who used it without hesitation once he'd committed. She had Bev Strand pre-positioning at the HVAC control panel in the basement with a direct line to Sarah's phone. She mapped the hospital's air handling zones against the most likely delivery points for an aerosolized agent, ground floor patient intake, the ER waiting area, the main atrium, and worked out a containment sequence that would isolate those zones without triggering visible alarm to the several hundred people currently in the building. She was doing this from the nursing supervisor's station on the second floor using a building schematic that Webb had pulled from the facility management system when Renata Ogle appeared. Renata took in the scene: Sarah at the supervisor's station, schematic on the screen, Webb standing beside her, Bev Strand's name on the phone display. And her face moved through several things rapidly, ending on an expression that was familiar. Controlled authority arriving to reassert itself. "What is happening here?" Renata said. "And why is a nurse who is currently on reduced hours at a supervisory station with access to building systems?" "Renata," Webb's voice was even, "I need you to step back and let us work." "Excuse me. I will explain everything in detail when there is time," he said. "Right now there is not time. Please step back." Renata looked at Webb. She looked at Sarah. The look she gave Sarah was the accumulated weight of 11 weeks of deliberate diminishment, and Sarah met it without expression and turned back to the schematic. "This is completely inappropriate," Renata said. "This nurse has been on a performance notice. She has no authority." "Renata." Webb's voice didn't rise. It compressed, which was more effective. "I am asking you to leave this area." Renata stood for a moment with the specific rigidity of someone whose institutional authority is failing to function in the way it's supposed to function. Then she turned and walked away, and Sarah heard her speaking on her own phone, to HR probably, or to hospital administration, and filed that as something to deal with later, after. She turned back to the schematic. Her own phone buzzed. Draper. She answered without stepping away from the station. Talk to me. Federal response ETA is now 3 hours, not 6. We pulled from a closer staging point, but Sarah, his voice had the compression again. We have movement at the annex site. The van left 7 minutes ago. We don't have a tail on it. We don't know where it went. Her hand went still on the schematic. You lost it. We were monitoring from satellite and it went under a bridge overpass and didn't come out the other side. There's a county road network in that area that isn't fully mapped in our system. It could have gone 3 different directions. She looked at the building schematic in front of her. The hospital's main loading dock was on the south side of the building. The mechanical room that housed the primary air handling intake was accessible from the loading dock corridor. It was the entry point she'd been thinking about since she left the service road, and she'd been thinking about it because it was the entry point she would have used. Lev, she said, I need you to route whatever surveillance assets you have in this area to the hospital's south perimeter right now. Loading dock, mechanical room access, South Service Road. On it. She could hear the commands going out. What are you going to do? She was already moving away from the supervisor's station, already heading for the stairs. What needs to be done? She said, and hung up before he could respond. She went down 2 flights. The basement corridor smelled of concrete and pipe insulation and the particular institutional air of spaces below the operational floors of a building. She moved fast, but not running. Running generated attention, and attention generated questions she didn't have time to answer. She passed the laundry, the central sterile supply room, the maintenance workshop, and came to the junction where the corridor split toward the plant operations room on the left and the loading dock access on the right. Bev Strand was at the plant operations room door with a keycard in her hand, exactly where Sarah had told her to be. She looked up when Sarah appeared, and her face had the look of a person who had spent 40 minutes telling herself this was probably nothing, and had now seen something in Sarah's face that confirmed it was not nothing. Be ready, Sarah said. When I call you, you shut it down. Everything, zone by zone, starting with the main atrium intake, then ER lobby, then patient intake. Don't wait for me to say why, just do it immediately. Okay, Bev said. Her voice was steady, which Sarah noted and respected. Sarah went right, toward the loading dock. The loading dock at this hour was typically quiet. Deliveries ran early morning or afternoon, and the mid-morning window was usually dead time. She came through the access door into the receiving area and stopped. The dock bay door was open 6 inches. It was not scheduled to be open. She could see it from the receiving desk, the gap of gray November daylight at the bottom of the bay door that shouldn't have been there, and she stood still for 3 seconds and listened. Movement. Soft, careful, unhurried movement from someone who believed they were alone in the space. She looked around the receiving area fast. The dock worker's cart was against the wall. On it, among the packing supplies and utility tools, was a 3-foot length of steel pipe used for securing pallet loads. She picked it up. It was not a firearm. It was what was available. She moved to the edge of the internal dock wall and went still. The bay door rolled up another 3 feet, not all at once, slowly, the way you'd open a door when you were trying not to generate noise. Daylight expanded across the dock floor. A figure came through the gap, bent low, moving with purpose, carrying a hard-sided case with the color-coded pressure indicators she'd seen on the service road an hour ago. She let him clear the door fully. She let him take 3 steps into the receiving area. Then she said, clearly and without heat, "Put it down." The figure stopped. He was a man in his 30s she didn't recognize, which meant hired logistics, not one of Harwick's core associates. I was carrying the case in both hands, and he turned toward her voice, and she watched the moment his eyes tracked from her face to the pipe, and the calculation that crossed his expression, assessing whether she was a problem or an obstacle. "Put the case down," she said, carefully, both hands visible. He set the case down with the deliberate care of someone who knew what was in it. Then he straightened. "There's a second one in the vehicle," he said, which was the strangest thing he could have said, and which meant he was telling her something, which meant something about his situation was more complicated than hired logistics. "Who sent you?" she said. Harwick. He looked at the case on the floor. I didn't know what I was carrying until 20 minutes ago. He told me it was pharmaceutical samples. His voice had the flat quality of someone moving through shock. I opened one of the seals to check, and there was a secondary container inside with a biohazard notation I've never seen outside a level 3 context. He looked at her. I drove here because the manifest said to. He stopped. I don't know what to do. Sarah was already on the phone to Bev. Now, she said, zone by zone, go. She looked at the man and at the case and at the open dock door, and she thought about the second unit in the vehicle and about the van's route from the annex and whether there were other vehicles, other routes, other delivery points she hadn't accounted for. And then her phone rang. Not Draper, not Bev. The number on the screen was one she had never seen before, and something about the timing, the precision of the timing, the fact that it rang in the exact moment she was standing in the loading dock with a biocontainment unit at her feet and a confused driver in front of her, told her before she answered who it was. She answered anyway. The voice was calm and professional and utterly recognizable, and it had been 3 years and 4 months since she'd heard it, and it said, Hello, Sarah. I've been watching you work. You're still remarkable, but I'm afraid you're standing in the wrong place. Hello, Sarah. I've been watching you work. You're still remarkable, but I'm afraid you're standing in the wrong place. She didn't move. She kept the phone at her ear and her eyes on the driver and the case and the open dock door simultaneously, running the statement through its possible meanings in the time it took to draw one breath. Wrong place. Not wrong building. Wrong place within the building. Where's the primary delivery point, she said. Not a question. A demand with a question's grammar. Harwick made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. His voice was the same as she remembered. Measured, precise. The voice of a man who had spent decades in academic and research environments where the ability to sound reasonable while saying unreasonable things was a professional asset. Still so direct. I always admired that about you, even when it was inconvenient. A pause. The loading dock was a diversion, Sarah. The driver delivered exactly what I needed him to deliver. You, in the basement, away from the floor where the actual work is happening. Her stomach dropped, not dramatically. It was a cold, internal drop, the specific sensation of a tactical mistake revealing itself. What floor? She said. Third floor mechanical access has a secondary intake connection to the main patient wing ventilation loop, he said. It's in the building schematic, if you'd looked at the full version. The one that includes the 2019 HVAC renovation. Your hospital acquired a very interesting infrastructure gap when they expanded the oncology ward. Another pause. I've had 4 months to study this building, Sarah. You've had 11 weeks. That's the difference. She was already moving. Back through the receiving area, through the access door, into the basement corridor. She pointed at the driver and said, Don't touch that case. Don't move. And she didn't have the authority to make that stick, and she didn't have time to care. She hit the stairwell at a run. She called Bev as she took the stairs 2 at a time. Third floor. Mechanical access. Is there a secondary HVAC intake room connected to the oncology wing expansion? She heard Bev moving, heard the sound of a keyboard. There's a... Yes. Room 3M. It's marked as mechanical storage on the floor plan, but it was retrofitted during the oncology build. It has an air handling connection that runs parallel to the main loop. Lock it down, Sarah said. That zone. Now. I already shut the main atrium and ER lobbies. Add the oncology wing loop. Add it now and then get security to 3M immediately. She hit the second floor landing. One more flight. Sarah, what is he? Just do it. She took the last flight, pushed through the third floor door. The third floor oncology wing was quiet at this hour, in the way that patient floors were quiet, not empty, but operating at the subdued frequency of people managing illness rather than emergency. A nursing station midway down the corridor. 2 housekeeping staff near the far elevator. Patient room doors mostly closed. The mechanical storage room was at the end of the east corridor, marked with a placard that said HVACs, storage, no patient access. The door was already open. She went through it fast and came to a hard stop inside because there was a man in the room who was not surprised to see her. He was in his early 60s, slightly built, with the gray pallor of someone who had spent the last several years under significant physiological stress. and he was wearing a maintenance uniform that didn't fit his posture, which was the posture of a man accustomed to a lab coat. He had a tablet in one hand and a device she recognized immediately in the other. A pressurized aerosol dispersal unit connected by a short length of tubing to the secondary intake grill on the north wall of the room. Dr. Edmund Harwick looked at her. She looked at the dispersal unit. "The activation sequence is already running," he said. "It started 40 seconds ago from a remote input. I'm not holding a trigger you can take from me." He held up the tablet to show her the screen. A progress indicator, a countdown, system confirmations running in sequence. "You have about 4 minutes before the dispersal cycle completes. Shutting down the air handling for this zone will slow it, but the agent is already in the intake plenum. There's enough mechanical pressure from the existing air column to distribute a partial dose regardless." She looked at the intake grill. She looked at the tablet. She looked at him. "Where's the abort sequence?" she said. "There isn't one," he said. "That was a design decision. I didn't want to be persuaded." He said it without heat, the same tone he'd have used to explain a methodology in a paper. "I want you to understand something, Sarah. This isn't personal in the way you're thinking. What happened to me, what you did, wasn't a personal injury. It was an institutional one. You used a system that was designed to protect its own interests, and you aimed it at my work. My work that would have—" "Harwick." Her voice cut him off cleanly. "I know what your work would have done. I was in the facility when it went wrong the first time. I saw what it did to the test subjects." Something moved in his face. Not guilt. She'd given up expecting guilt from him years ago. More like irritation at an inaccurate characterization. "The first iteration had limitations. What I've developed since is being used in a hospital," she said, "on cancer patients, on people who are already sick. Demonstrated immune response parameters in compromised populations. They're people." She said it flat. "They're not parameters." He looked at her with the expression she remembered from the first time she'd confronted him, years ago in a different room, in a different context. The expression of a man who genuinely could not locate the emotional register she was operating in, who understood it existed but processed it as an artifact rather than a fact. "You and I have always disagreed on that question," he said. "That's what this has always been about." She was looking at the dispersal unit while he talked. The tubing connection to the intake grill. The pressure gauge on the unit's body. The dispersal unit itself was a compact design, commercially adapted. She'd seen the model before, in a different application, in a context that gave her a specific and useful piece of information about the internal valve configuration. She needed to keep him talking for approximately 90 more seconds. "How did you get out of the holding facility?" she said. He blinked. The question shifted the register of the conversation, and she watched him recalibrate toward the answer, the way a certain kind of person always recalibrated toward the opportunity to explain their own ingenuity. The facility's medical staff had a rotating contractor position. It took 14 months to place someone in that position. The rest was timing and a basic understanding of institutional security patterns. He almost smiled. "Institutions trust their own systems more than they should. You know that better than most." "Who helped you?" she said. "The 2 associates." "Which ones?" "You're trying to gather information," he said. "For Draper." "Yes," she said. No point denying it. "Vance and Morrow," he said, and the names landed with the specific weight of confirmation. She had suspected Vance, who had been Harwick's lead synthesis chemist, but Morrow was a surprise because Morrow had cooperated with the initial investigation. Morrow felt the outcome of the investigation was unjust, as did I. "Morrow helped you build this." "Morrow improved on what we had." He glanced at the tablet. The progress indicator had moved. "Sarah, I don't want to have an argument with you about the ethics of research methodology in the next 3 minutes. I wanted to see you here. I wanted you to be present for this, because you were present at the end of the first chapter, and it seemed right that you'd be present at the beginning of the next one." He looked at her with something that was almost sincere. "I don't hate you. I want you to know that." "I don't care," she said, and then she moved. She crossed the 4 feet between them in the time it took him to register that she was moving, which was not enough time to stop her, and she got both hands on the dispersal unit, not at the body, but at the tubing connection to the intake grill, because the valve configuration on this model had an emergency disconnect at the junction fitting, a safety feature for the legitimate applications it had been adapted from. and she found it by feel and twisted it counterclockwise 90 degrees and pulled. The tubing disconnected. The pressure released outward into the room, not into the intake system. A sharp hiss of gas that dissipated in open air. In the 3 seconds she held her breath and turned her face away from the discharge point. Harwick grabbed her arm. He was stronger than he looked, or she was slower than she'd been at 30, or both. And they went sideways into the wall beside the intake grill, and the tablet hit the floor, and she heard the screen crack, and she got her elbow into his sternum with enough force to create distance. And then she was between him and the door, and he was against the wall, and breathing in the specific way of someone who has had the air knocked out of them and is trying to rebuild a response. She was breathing hard. Her hands were not shaking, which was either professionalism or adrenaline regulation, and she didn't stop to evaluate which. "The agent," she said. "What's the dispersal window? How much got into the plenum before I disconnected?" He looked at her from against the wall. Something in him had shifted. The composed academic register was cracked, the plan's failure landing in his system in real time. "Enough for symptomatic exposure in a concentrated zone," he said, and his voice was different now, flatter. "Possibly." He looked at the disconnected tubing on the floor. The shutdown Bev initiated for the oncology zone. If she completed it before the pressure in the plenum built sufficiently. "Answer me," Sarah said. "I don't know," he said. And for the first time in the conversation, she believed him completely. She was on the phone to Bev in the next second. "Tell me you completed the oncology zone shutdown." Bev's voice was tight. "Zone isolated 40 seconds ago. The loop is down. But Sarah, we have 6 patients in the oncology wing right now, and if there's any agent already in the duct, get them to positive pressure rooms," Sarah said. "Private rooms with the door seals engaged. Now, and get me the hospital's infection control officer on the line immediately." She looked at Harwick. "You're done," she said. He looked at the disconnected unit on the floor, at the tablet with its cracked screen, at Sarah standing between him and the door. He had the expression of a man who had spent 3 years planning something and was now standing in the wreckage of the plan's failure and did not yet have a framework for what came next. It was not the expression she'd expected. She'd expected something colder, something more defended. What she saw was exhaustion, not remorse. She wasn't going to construct remorse where it didn't exist. But exhaustion, the specific kind that came from running on obsession for too long, and something underneath it that looked, if she was reading it right, like a person who had arrived at the end of a very long road and found nothing there. "You should have let it go," she said. Not cruelly, as an observation. "So should you," he said. She heard security in the corridor 30 seconds later. What followed was not cinematic. It was not clean. It was 3 hours of controlled institutional crisis management in a mid-sized hospital that had just discovered it had a partial biocontainment event in a wing currently occupied by sick people, and the management of that crisis involved federal response teams in full PPE arriving through the hospital's service entrance, infection control protocols that required moving patients while minimizing their exposure to information that would cause panic, air quality monitoring in the oncology wing using equipment that the arriving federal team brought because Calloway Pines didn't own it, and a communication management structure that kept the event off the hospital's general communication channels while the situation was being assessed. Sarah was at the center of all of it, not because she had been designated to be, but because she was the person in the building who knew the most about what they were dealing with, and the federal team that arrived, 6 personnel from a response unit. She recognized the operational style of even if she didn't know their faces, looked at her when they arrived, and then looked at the situation, and then looked back at her and began treating her as the on-site coordinator without anyone formally making that designation. She gave them what they needed. The dispersal unit, still in the mechanical room. The disconnected tubing and the volume of agent, she estimated, had discharged into open air versus into the intake plenum, which was a calculation with significant uncertainty that she was honest about. The 6 patients in the oncology wing who had been isolated in positive pressure rooms and who were being monitored by a nursing team that Bev Strand had organized with remarkable efficiency given the circumstances. The room layout. The HVAC schematic, full version, which one of the federal team members confirmed matched what they had. Harwick was in police custody in a security office on the 2nd floor, and Vance and Morrow had been picked up by federal agents at the annex site 40 minutes after Sarah's location confirmation, which Draper confirmed by text in a message that was 3 sentences and contained more gratitude than she'd heard from him in 12 years combined. The driver from the loading dock was being interviewed. He was, as he'd appeared, a man who had been hired through intermediaries who had been careful about what they told him, and the investigation would establish his actual level of culpability over the following weeks. But Sarah's read of him, that he'd been genuinely horrified by what he'd discovered, appeared to be accurate. The air quality readings in the oncology wing came back at 1:47 p.m. She was standing with the lead federal response officer, a compact woman named Tessa Vale, who moved with the authority of someone who had done this before in worse conditions, when the monitoring team called in the results. Vale listened, made 2 notes on the pad in her hand, looked at Sarah. "Trace levels," Vale said. "Significantly below symptomatic threshold. The zone shutdown contained it." Sarah absorbed that. She absorbed it, standing in the corridor of a hospital where she was currently employed on reduced hours due to a performance notice, holding a pipe she'd taken from a dock worker's cart, wearing the clothes she'd put on at 6:45 in the morning in an apartment she'd chosen for its anonymity, and the information landed in her system not as triumph, but as the specific, exhausted relief of a thing that almost happened and didn't. "The patients are safe," she said. "The patients are safe," Vale confirmed. She set the pipe down against the wall. It made a sound when it hit the floor. "What?" Marcus Webb found her at 2:15 p.m., sitting on a bench in the hospital's exterior courtyard. It was cold. She hadn't gone back inside for a jacket. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at a bare branch tree in the center of the courtyard that had a bird in it, a sparrow or something close, that was moving methodically along the branches in the specific focused way of a creature looking for something to eat. Webb sat down beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "6 patients are safe," he said eventually. "Bev's team got them isolated in under 4 minutes." "Bev's good," Sarah said. "Yes." He was quiet again. "Vale's team wants to debrief you formally. Apparently there are people from 3 different federal agencies in the building right now who all want to talk to you." "I know." "And there are—" He stopped, recalibrated. "There are some things happening administratively. Renata went to the hospital's CEO this morning when she saw what was going on. She filed a formal complaint about you accessing building systems without authorization." He paused. "The CEO is currently in a meeting with 2 federal agents and a representative from a government office that nobody on the administrative team has been briefed about, and based on what I can hear through closed doors, the conversation is not going in Renata's direction." Sarah looked at the bird in the tree. It found something, ate it, moved on. "She was doing her job," Sarah said. "She didn't know." "I know she didn't know," Webb said. "That doesn't make 11 weeks of what she did to you acceptable." "No," Sarah said. "It doesn't." They sat with that for a moment. The courtyard was cold and gray and quiet, in the way of outdoor spaces adjacent to hospitals. The sound of the building's ventilation system, a distant siren, the ordinary ambient fabric of a place where difficult things happened regularly and the people managing them kept moving. "Who are you?" Webb said. Not the way he'd asked it before, with the edge of professional assessment in it. Just the question, plainly. She thought about how to answer that. The true answer had several layers, and some of those layers were classified, and some of them were simply hard to describe to someone who hadn't lived inside that particular kind of work. "I was a military trauma specialist," she said, "attached to special operations units for most of my career. The last few years before I left, I was working on threat response, biological, chemical, things that don't get press releases. Harwick's first facility was one of mine. That's how I knew him. That's how I knew what to look for today." She paused. "I left because I needed to stop, and I came here because it seemed like a place I could be useful without being—" She looked for the word. "Deployed. And instead you got restocking duty and a performance notice," Webb said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth. What you did today. The way you read those patients in that chaos, with no equipment and no authority and no backup. I've been in emergency medicine for 26 years and I've worked with people with every kind of credential there is." He stopped. "You're the best trauma clinician I've ever watched work." She looked at him. She didn't deflect it or minimize it, which was her usual instinct. She let it land. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. They sat for another moment. Then he said, "There's also something else you should know." He pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. It was a text thread from someone in hospital administration. She read it. "Renata's formal complaint is being reviewed," he said, "but so is everything else. The CEO has requested a full audit of staffing decisions in the nursing department over the last 6 months. That request came after the federal agents explained what happened today." He looked at the screen. "And Draper, whoever that is, apparently called the hospital's board chair directly an hour ago." Sarah looked at the phone. Then she looked back at the courtyard. "Lev does not like loose ends," she said. "Bottom." The debrief ran 4 hours and involved more people than she'd expected, in a conference room that Calloway Pines had apparently cleared of its usual function on short notice. Vale ran the federal side of it, methodical and thorough, and there were 2 people from another agency who didn't introduce themselves by full name and whose questions focused specifically on the research associates and the supply chain and the holding facility breach. Sarah answered what she could answer and was clear about what she couldn't, and Vale respected the line, which suggested Vale had a clearance level that made the line visible to her. At 6 p.m., Draper arrived in person. She'd been expecting this, and also, on a level she didn't fully examine, not expecting it. Not expecting the version of Draper who walked into the conference room, which was a man who looked 3 years older than the last time she'd seen him, and also, inexplicably, slightly relieved. He looked at her the way people looked at each other after something that had been very close to going badly didn't. "You disconnected it manually," he said, when the room had cleared down to the 2 of them in Vale. "It was a commercial adaptation. The valve fitting was standard. You were in a room with an active aerosolized agent dispersal unit, and you disconnected it manually." "I held my breath," she said. He stared at her. "You held your breath." For about 4 seconds. The room was ventilated. Vale, sitting at the far end of the table, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Draper sat down across from Sarah. He put his hands on the table. He looked like a man who had several things to say and was choosing between them. "The formal reinstatement process will take time," he said. "Bureaucracy. You know how it goes. But as of today, your classification status is restored, and your service record has been amended to reflect the full scope of your activities." He paused. "Including today." "That's not why I did it," she said. "I know that." He held her eyes. "Sarah, for what it's worth, you were right to leave when you left. I didn't think so at the time, but you were right. What it cost you, what you gave over 12 years, that's not nothing, and the way it ended wasn't right." She looked at her hands on the table. They were steady. They were always steady, which was something she was sometimes grateful for and sometimes found slightly eerie about herself. "It ended the way it ended," she said. "What matters is Harwick is in custody, and the agent is contained, and 6 patients in the oncology wing went home or went to sleep tonight without knowing how close it was." "Yes," Draper said. "That's what matters." She nodded. She looked at Vale. "What's the status on Morrow and Vance?" "Federal custody," Vale said. "Both. The annex site is being processed. From the preliminary assessment," she paused, with the specific hesitation of someone managing what they share, "it's a significant find. They'd been working for nearly 2 years. What they developed is more sophisticated than what Harwick had in the original facility, and the documentation at the site is extensive. Charges will be substantial." She looked at Sarah directly. "For all 3 of them." Sarah absorbed that. "The driver," she said. "Cooperating fully," Vale said. "The hired logistics story checks out. He'll be interviewed again, but current assessment is he's a witness, not a co-conspirator." She nodded. "Good." The conference room was quiet. Through the windows, she could see the parking lot and the early dark of a November evening, the hospital's exterior lighting coming on. The ordinary activity of a building that had held something terrible at the edge of its walls today and was continuing to function because that was what hospitals did. "What happens to the research?" she said. "What they built at the annex." "Secured and cataloged," Vale said. "It'll go to the appropriate federal research containment program." A pause. "None of it will ever be used the way Harwick intended." "Make sure of that," Sarah said. "I will," Vale said, and said it like someone who meant it. At 7:30 p.m., Draper stepped out to take a call, and Sarah was alone in the conference room for the first time since the morning, and she sat in the quiet for a moment and let herself be tired. Not defeated, tired. The specific, honest fatigue of someone who had run a very long way on will and training and the refusal to stop, and who had now stopped, and whose body was submitting its invoice. Her phone buzzed. A number she recognized. Kim Ferris. She answered. Kim. I heard something happen today. Kim's voice was careful. I don't know exactly what. Nobody's telling us much, but Webb... She paused. Webb came and found me an hour ago, and he told me you were okay, and I think he thought I needed to know that. Sarah looked at the window, the parking lot, the ordinary dark. I'm okay, she said. Are you actually okay, or are you answering the question on autopilot? She considered that. Both, she said. That's usually how it works. A pause on Kim's line. Someone from hospital administration came to the unit 20 minutes ago, Kim said. She said the nursing department is under a formal review. She said Renata Ogle has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Another pause. I don't entirely understand what's happening, but I think... She stopped. I think you had something to do with it. Not just today, the whole thing. Sarah didn't answer that directly. How are the oncology patients? She said. Stable, all 6. Dr. Reyes cleared them about an hour ago. A pause. Sarah, you should know, I went into medicine because I wanted to do what you did today. Not specifically today, I didn't know about today. But that thing, the thing where you see what's actually happening when everyone else is looking at the wrong thing. She paused. I don't know if I'll ever be that good, but I'm going to try. Something in Sarah's chest shifted, small and particular. You already are, she said. You called the JVD on the Whitmore case. That was you. After you, Kim. She said the name with enough weight to stop the deflection. That was you. A silence on the line. Then, okay, Kim said. Okay. They said goodbye. Sarah set the phone down. She sat in the quiet conference room of a hospital that had tried to push her out and had nearly become the site of a mass casualty event, and was now somewhere in its administrative levels, beginning to reckon with both of those facts simultaneously, and she let herself feel the full weight of the day without managing it into something smaller. Then she picked up the phone again. She called Draper's number. He answered in half a ring. What do you need? I need to know one thing, she said, before any of the official conversations happen, before the reinstatement process and the record amendments and whatever else comes next. She paused. The people who made the call to separate me 3 years ago, the ones who decided my record should go dark and I should disappear into a civilian job with a constructed file. Was that protective or was that punitive? The silence on Draper's end was 6 seconds long. She counted them. Both, he said, and I'm the one who made the call. She had suspected this. Knowing it and suspecting it were slightly different weights, and she held both. Why, she said. Because you'd seen things that made you a liability to people with significant institutional power, he said. And because I also genuinely thought you needed to stop. Those 2 reasons happened to align, and I let the alignment be convenient. A pause. That was wrong. I've known it was wrong for a while. She looked at her hands on the table. Steady. Always steady. I know, she said. That's why I needed to hear you say it. The line was quiet for a moment. Sarah, Draper said, there's something else. Something that came out of the annex site documentation in the last hour. His voice had changed again, back to the compressed register that meant the information was significant. They found communications. Between Harwick and the 2 associates and a third party we haven't identified yet. The communications go back 18 months. And some of them, he paused, some of them reference operational knowledge that Harwick shouldn't have had. Details about your location, your cover identity, the specific hospital you were placed at. She went still. Someone gave him that, Draper said. Someone inside the program. And based on the communication timestamps and the level of detail, another pause, this one heavy enough to carry its own weight. It wasn't someone peripheral. Sarah, someone with access to your full file helped Harwick find you. Conference room was quiet. The parking lot outside the window was ordinary and dark. Somewhere in the building a door opened and closed, and the ventilation system moved air through the ducts with the low, steady sound it always made. And Sarah Harlow sat with the phone at her ear and understood that what she'd thought was over had a door still open inside it, and behind that door was a question she didn't have an answer to yet, and the question had a face she hadn't seen yet, and somewhere between this moment and the next thing, she was going to have to find it. Somewhere between this moment and the next thing, she was going to have to find it. She sat with that for 30 seconds. The parking lot outside the window hadn't changed. The ventilation system kept its low, steady rhythm. Draper was still on the line, waiting, which was something he was actually good at when he chose to be. "How detailed are the communications?" she said. "Specific enough that it's not a leak from a peripheral system. Whoever shared this had read access to your active file, not the constructed cover, the real one." A pause. "We're looking at a small pool of people. Maybe 8, maybe 12. "Send me what you have," she said. "Sarah, Lev." She kept her voice level. "You just told me someone with access to my file helped a man who built a biological weapon find me in a hospital where I was restocking saline bags. Send me what you have." A silence. Then, "Give me 20 minutes." She set the phone face down on the conference table. She looked at the ceiling, which was the acoustic tile ceiling of a mid-size hospital conference room with a water stain in the northeast corner that nobody had gotten around to addressing. Ordinary. Completely ordinary. She thought about the 8 to 12 people who had access to her real file. She had worked with some of them for years. She knew their voices, their habits, the particular ways they thought under pressure. She ran them through the filter of what she knew about the communications Draper had described. 18 months of contact, operational detail, specific location information, and she let the filter run without forcing it, the way she'd learned to work through problems that needed to resolve on their own timeline rather than hers. 2 names surfaced. She sat with them. One of them she dismissed after 90 seconds, not because it was impossible, but because the timeline didn't fit what she knew about that person's access windows during the relevant period. The other one she didn't dismiss. The other one was a man named Curtis Beale, who had been the program's information security officer for 6 years, and who had, 18 months ago, been passed over for a senior position he'd expected to receive, and who had, in the months following that decision, become perceptibly quieter in ways that people attributed to disappointment, and that Sarah now understood might have been something else. She had worked 2 operations with Beale at the edges. She knew his analytical style. She knew that what Harwick would have offered him wasn't money, Beale wasn't motivated by money, but access. Research access. The kind of access that the senior position would have given him and that the rejection had removed. She called Draper back before the 20 minutes were up. "Beale," she said. "Curtis Beale. Check his system access logs against the communication timestamps from the annex documents. Check his personal financial records for consulting payments from any entity connected to Harwick's network. And check what he accessed in the month before my placement at Calloway Pines." A pause. The sound of Draper moving. "How certain are you?" 70%, she said, "which is enough to look." "Give me an hour," he said, and he said it with the tone of someone who already thought she was right. She set the phone down again. She looked at the water stain in the corner of the ceiling. She was tired in a way that had moved past the physical and into something older and less easily remedied. The tiredness of a person who had spent 12 years in a system that had ultimately used her and then obscured her and then allowed the person she'd exposed to find her, and who was now sitting in a hospital conference room in the clothes she'd put on 17 hours ago, figuring out who inside that same system had helped make all of it possible. There was no version of this that wasn't exhausting. There was also no version where she didn't see it through. Draper called back at 9:14 p.m. She knew from the first syllable that she'd been right. "Beale accessed your full placement file 11 days before your start date at Calloway Pines," Draper said. "No operational reason on record. He used a secondary authorization code that routed around the standard access log, but the routing itself left a trace that nobody was looking for until tonight." A pause. "There are 3 payments to a shell entity over 14 months. The amounts are small enough that they didn't trigger automated review. The entity traces to a holding company that traces to a research investment group that Morrow established using a nominee director." "Morrow was the bridge," Sarah said. "Morrow was the bridge. He knew Beale from before. They'd been at the same academic conference 6 years ago, stayed in contact. When Harwick came to Morrow, Morrow went to Beale." Draper's voice had the tight, controlled quality of someone managing significant anger through professional discipline. Beale is being picked up right now. Federal agents are at his residence. She absorbed this. Curtis Beale, 6 years of access, 18 months of betrayal. The specific and personal variety of institutional failure that came not from incompetence but from grievance that had been left to grow in the dark. His access to other files, she said. Who else did he compromise? That's the next several weeks of work, Draper said. But yours was targeted specifically. He didn't cast wide. He went narrow and precise, which suggests Harwick identified you as the priority and Beale delivered accordingly. A pause. Sarah, I'm sorry. This happened inside a system I run, and it was aimed at you. She sat with the apology. It was a real one. She could tell the difference by now, after enough years of receiving the other kind. I know, she said. We'll deal with the rest later. Yes, he said. We will. After she hung up, she sat for a moment and thought about what it meant that the people who were supposed to protect her cover had included the person who dismantled it. She thought about the supply card on C-Wing at 3 a.m., the inventory sheets, the 11 weeks of deliberate diminishment at the hands of someone who didn't know who she was. And she thought about how those two things were connected, the institutional betrayal at the classified level and the institutional small cruelty at the civilian one. And she recognized that they came from the same source, which was the particular human capacity to treat people as instruments rather than facts. Harwick had treated his research subjects as instruments. Beale had treated her file as a commodity. Renata Ogle had treated her position as a tool for managing a hierarchy that served Renata's comfort. None of them had looked at the person in front of them and seen a person. She had spent 12 years being looked at that way inside her own system, and 11 weeks being looked at that way in a hospital corridor, and she was done with both. She stood up. She picked up her phone. She went to find Webb. I was in his office, which she'd expected. It was nearly 10 p.m., and he was still in the building, which said something about the kind of physician he was. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and she could see the accumulated weight of the day in his face. Not defeat, just the honest fatigue of someone who had managed a significant institutional crisis and was still in the building because the work didn't stop when the crisis did. I need to tell you something, she said. Before whatever happens next, officially, I need to say it directly. Sit down, he said. She sat. She told him about Beale in broad terms, enough that he understood the shape of it, that someone inside the program that had placed her had given her location to Harwick, and that person was now in federal custody. She told him because he deserved to know that the danger that had entered his hospital today had come through a failure that was larger than anything local, and because he had trusted her this morning when he had every institutional reason not to, and that trust had been part of what made the outcome possible. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at his desk for a moment. So Harwick knew where you were from the beginning, he said. Likely before I arrived, she said. He let you settle in, get embedded, and then used you to access the hospital. He's a patient man, she said. That was always the most dangerous thing about him. Webb was quiet for a moment. The 6 patients in the oncology wing are safe, she said. The air quality results are confirmed. Trace levels only, well below any symptomatic threshold. Bev's shutdown was fast enough. She paused. Bev saved those patients. I want that clearly understood. It will be, he said. And then after a moment, what happens to you now? She had been thinking about this for the last 2 hours, in the gaps between the debrief and the phone calls, and the specific administrative weight of being at the center of a federal incident. There's a reinstatement process, she said. Draper wants me back in some formal capacity. Threat response, medical advisory, something with a title I haven't heard yet. She paused. I haven't decided. You haven't decided, he repeated. I left for reasons that were real, she said. Some of those reasons still exist. Some of them look different today than they did this morning. She looked at her hands. I need to think. Webb nodded. He didn't push, which she appreciated. Then he said, For whatever it's worth, and I understand it may not be worth much, given what this place put you through, I'd like you to stay. Not on supply staging. I'd like to restructure the trauma team's clinical specialist role to accommodate your actual background. He paused. We have patients who need what you can do. The Whitmore kid. The man you flagged for Gartner. There'll be more. There always are. She looked at him. He He was a man who had taken 11 weeks to understand who he was looking at, and who, once he understood, had not wasted time on the gap between what he'd assumed and what was real. There was honesty in that she respected. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. Well, what happened over the next 6 weeks was not a single event, but a series of them, and they arrived in the specific non-cinematic way that institutional consequences actually arrived, slowly, bureaucratically, with paperwork and review boards and formal notifications that used language so precise it sometimes obscured rather than clarified the thing it was describing. Edmund Harwick was charged with 8 federal counts, including development and attempted deployment of a biological agent, conspiracy, unlawful flight from federal custody, and 4 counts related to the original research violations that had ended his career the first time. His attorneys entered a not guilty plea that no one in the federal prosecutor's office treated as a serious obstacle. The case, Vail told Sarah by phone 3 weeks after the incident, was airtight. The annex documentation alone was enough to sustain every charge, and Morrow and Vance had both entered cooperation agreements within 72 hours of their arrest. Marcus Vance received his cooperation agreement and a reduced charge set that would still result in a minimum 8-year sentence. His testimony about the supply chain, the synthesis process, and the timeline of the project was detailed enough to close several gaps in the prosecution's case that would otherwise have required months of additional investigation. Nora Morrow, and Sarah had been wrong about the first name, she'd assumed male, received no cooperation agreement. This was apparently her own decision, which her attorneys argued against and which she declined to reverse. She was charged on the same count set as Harwick and faced the same sentencing exposure. The federal prosecutor noted in a press statement that the sophistication of the modified pathogen at the annex site represented a significant advancement over what Harwick's original research had produced, and that Morrow's specific contributions to that advancement would be a central element of the government's case. Curtis Beale resigned from his position on the second day after his arrest, before the formal administrative process that would have removed him could complete. He was charged with 2 federal counts of unauthorized disclosure of classified information and 1 count of material support to a person engaged in a bioterrorism-related conspiracy. His attorneys were arguing for a cooperation framework. The federal prosecutor's office had not yet indicated whether they were interested. The pool of people who had held access to Sarah's real file was reduced to the 7 who remained after Beale's removal, and each of them was informed, through formal channels, of what had occurred and what had been discovered. Sarah was told this by Draper in a phone call in which he also told her that the program's file security architecture was being rebuilt from scratch, which was the kind of institutional response that was both completely necessary and about 4 years overdue. Renata Ogle was a separate matter entirely, unconnected to the federal investigation, but running on its own track through the hospital's administrative structure. The formal audit of the nursing department that the CEO had initiated in the immediate aftermath of the incident took 3 weeks to complete. It documented a pattern of scheduling manipulation, documented performance notices used as management tools rather than legitimate professional development instruments, and 3 separate instances of staff reassignment that appeared to be retaliatory in nature. Renata was placed on a formal corrective action plan with a 60-day review period, during which her authority over direct staff scheduling was transferred to a deputy director. The hospital's HR department issued a formal finding that Sarah's performance notice lacked documentary support sufficient to meet the hospital's own standards. Sarah was informed of the HR finding by a representative from the hospital's legal office who called her on a Wednesday morning and read the relevant language from the document in a tone that suggested he had done this before and found it equally awkward every time. She thanked him and hung up and sat with it for a moment. It was not nothing. She knew it was not nothing. The performance notice had been real in its effect. The reduced hours, the lost assignments, the daily accumulation of being treated as less than what she was, and the finding that it lacked proper support was the institutional acknowledgement that those things had been wrong. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She felt the specific quieter thing that came from a wrong being acknowledged, which was not the same as satisfaction, but was its own genuine thing. Renata Ogle came to find her 3 weeks after the corrective action was issued. This surprised Sarah, which was itself somewhat surprising. She didn't usually miscalculate what people would do. Renata appeared in the doorway of the break room at 2 a.m., which was when Sarah was there alone. and she stood in the doorway for a moment before she came in. She didn't sit down. She stood at a moderate distance and she said, "I didn't know." Her voice was level, but something underneath it wasn't. "I want to be clear that I'm not using that as an excuse. I treated you in a way that was wrong, regardless of who you were or what you'd done before. I want you to know that I understand that." Sarah looked at her. The admission was real. She could read real from performed at this point with a reasonable degree of accuracy. It was also incomplete in the way that most admissions were incomplete, because understanding the abstract wrongness of something and fully reckoning with its specific costs were two different exercises. "I know you didn't know," Sarah said. "If I thought it was personal, I'd have handled it differently." She paused. "It wasn't personal, but it was still wrong." "Yes," Renata said. "It was." They stood in the break room at 2 a.m. with that between them, and Sarah thought about what she wanted to do with it. She could hold it. She could put it in the compartment with the other things that were real and unresolved. Or she could let it be what it was, a person who had used her institutional authority badly, arriving to say so, in the middle of the night, in the break room where Sarah had sat alone with bad coffee for 11 weeks. "Okay," Sarah said. "Thank you for saying it." Renata nodded. She left. Sarah sat with her coffee for another few minutes, and the building made its ordinary sounds around her, and she thought about the specific nature of the people who had diminished her here. Not evil, mostly. Not Harwick level. Mostly just people who had looked at someone and decided what they were seeing without looking closely enough, and who had then organized their behavior around that decision with confidence. It was the oldest mistake in the world, and it cost things. It cost the people on the receiving end of it, things that didn't always get returned, and it cost the people who did it something too, even if they didn't feel it in the same way. She had spent a lot of her life being the person who got cost things. She had also, more recently, spent some time understanding that the thing that had allowed her to survive all of it was not that she was exceptional in some category that made her invulnerable. It was simpler and less flattering than that. She had survived it because she had refused to let other people's misread of her become her own. That was the thing nobody had given her. She'd had to build it herself, over years, out of the same material the difficulties were made of. She gave Draper her answer on a Thursday morning in December, standing in the hospital parking lot in the cold with her breath visible in the air. "I'll do the advisory work," she said. "Part-time, remote when possible, on-site when necessary. I want defined parameters, and I want them in writing, and I want the right to terminate the engagement if the parameters change without my agreement." A pause on his end. "That's more conditions than you used to bring to the table." "I know more than I used to," she said. "Fair," he said. "I'll have the framework to you by end of week." "And Lev," she paused, "the framework needs to include a provision. If there's ever a situation like the one with Beale, someone inside the program acting against operational personnel, it comes to me. Not after. During." "That's," he started. "Non-negotiable," she said. A silence. "Okay," he said. She went back inside. She had also the day before accepted Webb's offer. Not the title he'd proposed. They'd renegotiated that into something that better reflected what the role actually was, which was a hybrid clinical specialist position with trauma focus and no supply cart responsibilities. The hours were her own, structured around the advisory work. The pay was better than supply staging by an amount that would have been funny if the 11 weeks hadn't been what they were. On her first shift in the new role, she arrived at 7 a.m. and went to the trauma bay and stood at the edge of it for a moment, taking in the space. The layout she'd memorized, the equipment positions she'd cataloged, the crash cart with the correctly sized laryngoscope blade that had been replaced 3 weeks ago, after she'd filed a maintenance report that was actually processed this time. Bev Strand found her there. "Good morning," Bev said, with the tone of someone who had decided not to make this a bigger moment than it needed to be, which was exactly the right decision. "Morning," Sarah said. They stood together for a moment, looking at the bay. "You know Okafor asked about you," Bev said. "Danny. He heard what happened and he wanted to know who the nurse was." A pause. "I told him. He said he'd been wondering for a while why the supply staging nurse always knew where the crash carts were." Sarah looked at the bay. "I moved them twice," she said. "Both times they were in the wrong position for the fastest gurney access." "I noticed," Bev said. "I just didn't know why you noticed." She paused. "I know now." Sarah looked at her. Bev Strand was a woman who had been doing hard work well for a long time, and who had, at 4 a.m. in a basement corridor, taken the word of a nurse she barely knew and shut down a ventilation system that turned out to matter. She hadn't asked for documentation or reassurance or a chain of command approval. She'd looked at Sarah and made a judgment call that was correct, and the 6 patients in the oncology wing had gone home to their families because of it. "Thank you," Sarah said, for the HVAC shut down. The timing was everything. Bev was quiet for a moment. "You called, I acted," she said. "That's how it's supposed to work." "Yes," Sarah said. "That's how it's supposed to work." Usha. Kim Ferris came to find her 3 weeks into the new role, during a break in a shift that had run 12 hours, and showed no signs of concluding. She found Sarah at the supply cart. The right supply cart. The trauma bay cart. The one Sarah was now responsible for, in a way that meant she actually managed its contents rather than just restocking them. And she sat on the edge of a nearby counter and said, "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me," Sarah said. "About why you stayed," Kim said. "Not here specifically, in nursing. After everything you'd done, you came to a civilian hospital and took the worst assignments and didn't complain." She paused. "I couldn't figure out if that was humility or something else." Sarah thought about that. She thought about the supply cart at 3 a.m. and the inventory sheets, and the terrible coffee, and the 11 weeks of being looked through rather than at. She thought about the Whitmore kid going home to his mother, and the man Gartner had almost missed, and the 6 people in the oncology wing who had slept through the closest call of their lives without knowing it had happened. "It wasn't humility," she said. "I was tired. I needed to stop doing the large version of the work and do a smaller version for a while." She paused. But the work was still the work. The reason for doing it was still the same reason. "What's the reason?" Kim said. Sarah looked at the supply cart, at the saline bags and the IV tubing and the correctly sized laryngoscope blade and the defibrillator pads and all the unremarkable equipment of keeping people alive in ordinary and extraordinary circumstances. "Because they come in, and they're frightened, and they're in pain, and they need someone in the room who knows what they're doing," she said. "That's all. That's the whole reason." She paused. "Everything else, the rank, the title, the recognition, whether anyone knows your name or thinks you matter, none of it changes whether the patient in front of you lives or dies. Only the work does." Kim looked at her for a moment. "I'm going to remember that," she said. "Good," Sarah said. "Now go back to your patient." Kim went. The formal public record of what had happened at Calloway Pines Medical Center that November was released 3 months later by the relevant federal agency in a statement that was factual and thorough, and that identified Sarah Harlow by name as the on-site responder whose actions had contained the threat before the federal response team arrived. The statement was picked up by several news organizations. The hospital issued its own statement. Webb gave a brief press comment in which he described Sarah as the finest trauma clinician he had worked with in 26 years of emergency medicine, and said it without hyperbole, in the specific flat tone of a man stating a professional assessment he had verified. Sarah did not give any press comments. She was working a day shift when the statement was released and the reporters were in the lobby, and she went through the employee entrance and got to the trauma bay and started her shift. Her military record was formally amended 6 weeks after the incident, the full scope of her service restored and documented, the gaps filled in with the accurate version of events. The amended record was not public. It was never going to be public. But it existed in the file where it belonged, alongside 12 years of work that had mattered even when it had been hidden. Draper sent her a copy. She read it once. She put it in a drawer. What she kept on her desk, the small desk in the new office adjacent to the trauma bay that Webb had arranged without being asked, was a photograph. Not from her military years. It was a photo someone had taken without her knowledge during a particularly chaotic shift, one of the hospital's administrative photographers documenting the ER for an internal publication. In the photo, Sarah was at the bedside of a patient whose face wasn't visible, and she was doing something with her hands that was specific and clinical and competent. And she was looking at the patient with the specific focused attention she brought to everything, and she looked completely in the right place. She looked like exactly what she was. Not the decorated specialist with the restored record, not the woman the federal statement had named, not the person Renata Ogle had tried to reduce to a supply staging function, or the person Draper's system had tried to make disappear. Just a woman at a bedside doing the work that needed to be done in a hospital that had nearly failed her and had ultimately, imperfectly, bureaucratically, too slowly, begun to correct that failure. There was something she had learned, not from the military and not from the 11 weeks at Calloway Pines, but from the space between them, from the 3 a.m. break room and the inventory sheets, and the years of being in rooms where she knew the most and was treated as though she knew nothing. The lesson was not the easy one, not the one that said the truth always comes out, or that patience is rewarded, or that institutions eventually get it right. The actual lesson was harder and more useful than any of those. It was that the people who diminish you, who decide what you are before they've looked, who use their institutional power to make you smaller so they can feel larger, those people are not the measure of you. They are only the measure of themselves. And the work that you do, the real work, the work that happens between a skilled pair of hands and a person in need, that work is entirely independent of whether anyone in the room recognizes what they're witnessing. Sarah Harlow had been the most capable person in every room she'd occupied for 12 years, in circumstances that most people would not survive and could not describe, and she had been invisible in all of them by design. She had then been the most capable person in an emergency room for 11 weeks and been invisible there too, by someone else's design. And in both cases, the work had been the same work. The value of it had been identical regardless of who acknowledged it. That was the thing worth holding on to. Not the vindication, though the vindication was real and she was not pretending it didn't matter. But underneath the vindication, more durable than it, was the simple fact that she had known what she was doing when no one else believed it, and she had done it anyway. And the patients who were alive because of that didn't require a press statement or a federal record amendment to be alive. They were just alive. That was enough. It had always been enough. She had just needed 11 weeks in the worst assignment in the hospital to remember it clearly. She was at the trauma bay supply cart at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in January, checking the laryngoscope blade for the third time that week, because checking it was now her habit, and her habit was good, when Danny Okafor came in for the day shift and stopped beside her. "You know," he said, "most of the clinical specialists don't personally verify the blade sizing." "Most of the clinical specialists weren't here when it was the wrong size," she said. He looked at the blade. He looked at her. He had the expression of someone who had been told a version of her story and was still assembling the full picture. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad you're here." She put the blade back. She picked up the inventory sheet. "So am I," she said, and she meant it in a way that was completely uncomplicated, the way you meant things when you had arrived somewhere through enough difficulty that you could feel the actual ground under your feet.